Good. I'll tell you really quick here. I occasionally have some internet issues. I live out in the country, so if things freeze up on me, I may have to reboot it and come back. So
Sure, no problem.
No worries. We understand how that works.
joys of living in the country sometimes.
Our president, Jack, lives out in the country. He's my father, but he lives just 15-20 minutes outside of downtown Ann Arbor. We literally could drive from the stadium to my parents' house in 15 minutes, and they have no cable. They're so far in the country, supposedly. Hello, thank you everybody who is joining us this evening.
See, we have a few folks here joining on as we begin to get started here. Thank you all for joining us again. My name is Rich Griffin, and I'm the campaign director here at Michigan Justice Advocacy. And as you log on here, you'll be joined by my colleague, Mariah L-W Wagner, as well as our host of panelists here. And we'll give folks a couple of minutes to join to see how many people here log on. I know some folks are concluding their day and trying to rush to get things accomplished, so we won't put folks on that stringent of a timeline. But we'll probably get started here in the next couple of moments. So give us, let's say 2 more minutes, Mariah. That sound about good to you?
Sounds like a plan.
All righty. Let me see, what do we have here? All righty. So I think we'll get started here now as we're reaching the 7 o'clock hour. We don't want to make sure that we give folks the appropriate time and get people out of here. I know everybody's day is pretty busy. So again, my name is Rich Griffin, and I'm the campaign director here at Michigan Justice Advocacy. Thank you all for joining us this evening for another installation of our town hall series here over the next couple of months. I will kick it over to Mariah real quickly for her introduction as well, and then we'll spend a few moments talking about some organizational goals and what some of our work looks like from our own individual capacity before we get into questions for the panelists that have joined us this evening.
Thanks, Rich. My name is Mariah. I am Michigan Justice Advocacy's Executive Director. I am really excited for us to have this conversation and talk about this topic of correction officers and how does a good time credit system help correction officers and our corrections system here in Michigan. Michigan Justice Advocacy is a 501c4. We are working on legislative work here in the state of Michigan, and our focus is on a good time credit system currently. We are working on implementing a credit system here for Michigan through the legislative route using a bill. So as we talk about this, that is kind of the frame of reference that we are using. And I will go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves here. And I will go ahead and start with Professor Rich Gee.
Hi, my name is Richard Gee. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Finlandia University up in the Ube. And I do comparative work and teach a class that takes students to Finland. And we tour facilities in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And we give them the full gamut from former Soviet military prison experience all the way to Finnish gentle justice.
Thank you for that. Ombudsman Keith Barber.
Hi, I'm Keith Barber. I'm the Legislative Corrections Ombudsman here in Michigan. We are a nonpartisan legislative agency, and our responsibility is to investigate complaints about the state prison system and try to resolve those, and then work with the Michigan legislature to impact policy at the state level. So we don't take positions on legislation, but we are a resource for legislators, and I've been with the office now for over 33 years.
Thank you. And Deputy Warden, is it Pete?
Yes, I'm a former Deputy Secretary for the Department of Public Safety for the state of Maryland. I'm sort of a hybrid. I spent 27 years as a police officer, retiring as a commander, went into public safety, ultimately managing and working with our correction systems around a lot of issues, but I ended my career Deputy Secretary of Public Safety, is responsible for the three principal agencies of public safety: pretrial, corrections, and parole and probation. And so that's been my orientation. So I'm sort of half police, half corrections. No one has that kind of experience in a lot of venues, and I try to approach it from that perspective.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. Rich, if you want to go ahead and start with the first question there.
Sure. Some of the focus here tonight will be, from the correction side of it and the law enforcement side. So for, I guess this question of what are the current workplace struggles for corrections officers in the prison system? And I guess we can start with Mr. France with that question. And if folks want to chime in, but to you particularly, sir, what are the current workplace struggles that you found in your workspace for the corrections officers there in Maryland or nationally?
Well, three things have to be considered. First, we have to look at who is coming into the system. Secondly, why they're coming into the system. And third, how do we prepare them to leave the system? Who comes in, why they're there, and how well do we prepare them to leave the system? And so from a societal perspective, there's a disillusion or misperception of what the correction environment is about. So we know that there's a certain group of folks come into the system, 18 to 24 years of age, normally for either some drug-related offenses or some offenses related to a drug activity. How do we prepare them is secondly. Do they have the appropriate educational skills? Are they able to manage themselves as relates to some vocation? Are they able to understand what it is that got them into the system? And then how do we prepare them to leave the system? What are the systems? What are the supports external to corrections environment that helps people to succeed? And do we even understand what returning citizens need in order to give them an indication of success or what success looks like once they leave a corrections environment?
Thank you, Mr. Barber. In some of in your experience, I know that your office oversees many of the complaints that are lodged at at the Department of Corrections. But in response to those complaints, what have you seen as one of the topmost struggles for corrections officers here in MDOC?
Sure. I spent my first 21 years with the office in the field. So I visited all of our correctional facilities at one point of time or another. And I have known a lot of corrections officers and various corrections staff at every level. So in those conversations with those folks, training seems to be one of the biggest issues that they really would like to wrap their heads around. And that we have some pretty decent training in Michigan for our corrections officers, but there seems to be a desire to move towards maybe more of a crisis intervention training kind of module, at least with a number of them. I don't want to speak on behalf of all corrections officers or their union, of course, but A lot of folks I talk to would like to have better tools that they can use for management purposes. Um, I think they felt they were more engaged that way with training and able to work in more of a collaborative environment inside the institution. That would be really great for them. We have a real problem with shortage of officers, so there's really a kind of a big morale problem going on, and it's been like that for several years at least now. We've had a shortage of corrections officers in our prisons for a number of years, and all the overtime folks work really drags them down too. I mean, it's really hard to be sharp after working a double shift, 16 hours a day. And that gets old after a while. You know, the money's great, I suppose, but it really interferes with lots of things, their personal life, health in many cases. And so that's another thing that I think we need to wrap our heads around here that's been expressed to me, is to find better ways or different ways maybe to recruit and retain corrections officers. So I think those are two of the big things that I see from corrections officer. I hear from them rather. And so another thing is having their voice heard, you know, to be part of the system. We have a top-down paramilitary kind of organization here, and I understand that and how and why that all works. And there is some opportunity for involvement for corrections officers and other corrections staff to be involved in policy formation and different things of that nature. But most corrections officers that I talk to don't feel that any input they have is taken seriously or even listened to at all. Mm-hmm. So those are probably the big three that I've heard, and those have not changed over time.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thank you for that input. Professor, same question for you, if you'd like to respond to that. But I guess with the context of where your curriculum or the curriculum that you all have been sharing and exposing students to at your university, how have you seen what actual struggles are in correction systems in alignment with the curriculum in the way in which you guys are rolling it out there at your university, if that makes sense?
I just really quickly wanted to go back to what Keith said about the lack of autonomy and the lack of having your voice heard. You know, when you've got organizationally, when you've got people that are the front line, they may be the best ones to help identify where there's a problem, where something can be done better. And because of that hierarchical structure, they are not going to be heard because they're not the ones that have the education, you know. And so they don't feel like they're valued. And if they're given something, if they're trying and providing a recommendation, and it's kind of brushed off, that diminishes their sense of job satisfaction. I mean, if we focus on job satisfaction as doing something that's meaningful to the person that's doing it, you got to have something more. You got to have skin in the game, and being able to provide your voice through that, and people taking stock of it and allowing your knowledge of frontline behavior. One of the things that we do is that the Finlandia's program really kind of focuses on restorative practice. We are a Finnish Lutheran institution, and so we do focus on community practice, community corrections. And we also have courses that focus on some of the problems related to prisons. And so mixed messages for staff, right? Here's your rule book. Here's the operating procedure. Follow this. And then 3 days in, that's not the way it's supposed to go. Because you're going to have someone that's in there that says, oh, no. Take that book, throw it in file 13 and pay attention to what it is that I'm doing. You may have the most idealistic and CO that's coming in, and they've got great ideas and they want to make a difference. And within the scope of 6 months, they've been ground down to, this is the way you do the job. Okay, and this isn't the only place that we see it. We see it in education, we see it in policing, all of that stuff. In these organizational structures, there's this organizational culture that takes precedent and imposes itself, and it reifies itself over time.
Sure. That perfect segue into one of the secondary question here is, from your perspective, what can be done to decrease those problems and improve that work environment? Not just for the folks who, are on the admin level, but as well as the frontline folks, the officers that are working in the housing units. What do you see as one of the key things that can be done to decrease those issues?
I don't know if I could drill it down to one key thing. You've got to have administration that values their work, the people that work for them, that recognizes that being a manager, being a leader requires this interactional dyadic relationship, and it's not a top-down. You've got to have COs that, and this is just kind of my own personal plug, that are well educated, right? And to understand who's coming in, why are they coming in, what are we doing to get them ready to go out, right? When I look at the 15 credit hour academy, I would add a lot more to it for the regular CO. They need to have courses in psychology. They need to have courses in sociology. They need to understand cultural differences between where they're coming from and where the people that are in their care are coming from. And it's particularly evident up here because the prison up here, this is where this is the threat that they send the folks down from downstate. If they can't behave themselves, they're going to isolate them to this maximum security, medium security up in the UP.
Thank you for that. Mr. Fran, same question for you. In your capacity, what do you believe are some, things that can be done to decrease the issues that you've seen in your work?
Well, to piggyback on what was just said by Mr. G, you got to remember that in the state of Maryland, we have a corrections academy that's about 7 weeks. Conversely, police officers are in a academy environment for 26 weeks. But some of the skill sets are similar. Some of the desired outcomes are similar. So we have to work more aggressively in preparing correctional officers to understand the challenges that they will meet once they enter the environment. Corrections officers don't have the ability to discern what was the intent of the sentencing judge: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation. The corrections officer doesn't know what the intent of the judge was when the judge made that decision. But we all know that the judge makes a decision based on one of those reasons, or we think it's one of those reasons. The corrections officer gets a person, and then he has to orient that person into a corrections environment without the background, without the background, without the true understanding of who that individual is. And so to be able to do that on the fly, to be able to make that assessment pretty much on the run, to understand who that individual is that's coming into the environment, takes a lot for a correctional officer to deal with. Then to not only orient that individual, but to orient myself into how I'm going to interact with that individual. So as I said, I was a police officer. So I was a guy that said, lock them up, put them behind bars, don't let them out. Then I became a corrections manager, and I'm saying, whoa, we can't be locking all these people up. There's got to be some alternatives for these people that we can exert that will keep some of these people out of the system, because the correction system is not designed to handle all these people. So I had my own metaphor for this. I had to come to Jesus moment and say, whoa, we can't be locking these people up. We got to find some other alternatives to incarceration. And some of those alternatives may simply be understanding where a person is at the time of their most recent offense. And how do we make sure that when they enter into the correction environment, that we kind of make sure that we retain their wholeness as an individual as we begin to allow them to prepare themselves to re-enter the community. And that's unique. Nobody wants to hear that. But we have to build into these systems the capacity to understand that we got to push these people, move these people, process these people back to the community they came from, with the expectation, the anticipation, the hope that they will not reoffend. There's enough research, there's enough data that tells us who's going to reoffend, when they're going to reoffend, and why. And so we should use that data to manage our correction system and even our policing and court systems, so that we understand who needs to go to prison, who needs to be placed into some other type of diversion programs, who needs to just have that stuff thrown out and get rid of at the first low levels of the criminal justice system, so we don't even talk about incarceration. But we as Americans, listen to me now, we as Americans want punishment. We want people to be punished. And we don't give a damn what that looks like, as long as you tell us that you punish them. We can't punish people in the same form that society wants them to. So we need to explain to society why we can't do what it is that they expect, and then move people into the different strata, the different processes, different venues that would be most helpful to return them as hopeful and helpful citizens. Hope that wasn't too extractive.
No, definitely. I appreciate, sometimes it's necessary to expound on those topics and conversations. So I appreciate your insight there. Mr. Barber, same question for you. In working, directly with Michigan Department of Corrections employees, as well as those that are housed there, I'm sure you have some very peculiar insights as to, how the issues that you've been able to experience that folks have had. What can be done here to decrease some of those issues?
Yeah, and I think Pete really hit on a lot of it. Pete and Rich both, and the length of things just goes to show there are no easy answers to this. I think that's one of the problems that we all encounter in our various careers around the system, is that lots of people look to us in the system for simple answers, and this is not a simple thing. But we keep trying to find simple solutions, and I think Pete's right on the money. We just have been so all over the punishment thing in this country. We need to figure that out and start moving. And I see that happening in some small ways, some a little bit larger ways here in Michigan and in other parts of the country. So there is hope, I think, and we can move in a better direction, but we just really have to embrace it. And I think stop taking baby steps and really leap into this stuff and to make some significant change. We have an 8-week academy here rather than the 7 weeks that Pete was talking about. And then they go to whatever prison they're going to be working at for on-the-job training, and then return back briefly to the academy. The 15 college credits, they're required by law in Michigan to have corrections officers are, but that can be waived, and it has been waived during this time where they're trying to recruit folks and get people into the corrections officer field. I think one of the things that would be hugely helpful would be something I mentioned earlier, like CIT, crisis intervention training for officers. That concept can and has been adapted in some areas for corrections. We could, I think, give folks a much better tools to manage the population that they're trying to manage, interact with. As Pete indicated, corrections can't pick and choose who they get. Whoever the court sends them is who they have to take. And then they have to figure out a way to manage those folks. And as it trickles down to the COs, they don't have that information, as Pete indicated, to have any understanding of what's going on with these folks, that they are required to manage. And that becomes even more compounded when you're short-staffed and you're working a lot of overtime and you're tired all the time trying to just think. I had an opportunity to go to Germany and Norway about a year and a half-ish ago with Very Institute of Justice and take a look. It was a quick 1-week trip, so I'm certainly not an expert on it, but one of the things I took away, and we had somebody from the Corrections Officers Union, he was the guy who invited me to go, actually. And that really was very impactful for me. I didn't realize, because I just haven't had an opportunity to study it, that they have 2 years of training. I mean, it's very involved, and they take the kinds of classes that Rich was talking about, psychology and lots of different kinds of things that will help them on the job in identifying problematic behaviors and knowing how to refer them to the right locations. They also tend to not hang on to mentally ill prisoners in the prison setting. If someone's in crisis, there's more of a tendency to go to a therapeutic sort of environment that's operated by their mental health system, rather than keeping them in prison and trying to provide the mental health in prison. So, I mean, coming full circle, I think it's a lot of things. I don't think it's just one thing you can boil it down to. And it goes right back to the things the other panelists have said, deciding on how we police, where we police, who we arrest, how do we prosecute, how do we decide who we're going to prosecute, and then how much time is someone given. Those are things that different communities are looking at here in Michigan and other places, but there doesn't seem to be a cohesive statewide view of how to approach this whole criminal justice thing. And there are pieces of it that are coming together, but I think we need to try to look at it in a more holistic way than trying to cherry pick different things, which we've done and continue to do. And it has some impact, but it's not as impactful as it could be.
Sure. Thank you for that. Some of your comments brings me to the idea of, we're here having this conversation tonight. And for the folks who've joined on this call who aren't aware, Michigan Justice Advocacy is pushing for a good time credit policy to be passed here in Michigan. And some of those asks, one of which would be for a retroactive application of what the additional asks are. So one of the questions that we wanted to make sure that we got you all to speak to was, what a good time credit policy, if instituted, not just here in Michigan, but from as well as your perspective, Mr. France. And I'd like you to weigh in on this first, because does Maryland currently have a good time policy in its corrections institution?
Yes. The two.
Yeah, from your perspective, how has that been used to alleviate some of the workplace issues with corrections officers, but as well as recidivism when it comes to the citizens of Maryland?
Well, two things to consider. Good time credits, what we call in Maryland diminution credits, come in a couple different ways as they do in most systems. I don't think they have a great deal of impact on recidivism. And I don't think good time or diminution credits are fully understood by the general public. But from a perspective of a incarcerated individual, they're clearly understood. Uh, First, from a perspective of reducing the amount of time that I'm going to serve in a prison, and secondly, based on the types of housing or the types of programs I'm going to be uh, able to participate in as an incarcerated individual. So let's take the first understanding. Um, Programming, housing, behavior, they're all factored into the ability of an inmate to reduce their time in incarcerated environment. Double cell housing, certain types of um, uh, programming, education programming, program related to cognitive issues that an inmate may be experiencing. Uh, then we talk about um, eligibility for certain work assignments and how work assignments can enhance not only your income as a prisoner or the amount of money you make, but also make you more suitable for consideration for work release, pre-release, and so forth. And so these credits provide an incentive that impact behavior and also help with maintaining the structure. And the structure is a structure of orderliness. People outside of corrections may not use those terms, but you have to have an understanding of the exchange environment you are in with inmates as a prison administrator. And that exchange environment involves all of the ancillary and programmatic things that an inmate may be exposed to or afforded to. And so there's a give and a take. If there's an environment where we're giving to inmates based on this exchange environment, certain credits based on behavior, um, adjustment, conformity, whatever you want to call it, that helps to maintain an orderly prison. So most wardens want to be involved in a situation where the inmates in their institution understand their relationship. Sometimes that can be contentious. The inmate population and the administration may meet a loggerhead. So you have to come to some understanding what that means. But without that exchange environment and without that interaction between the inmate population and the administration, you don't have orderly prisons. You have chaos. You have chaos. And so most prison wardens, as I was, most prison administrators, as I was, they want to be able to ensure that there's some orderliness, there's some structure, and there's some conformity, at least to the basic rules that we have established. And in exchange for that, we give good time credits, we give diminution credits, we give family days, we give certain meals. There's a variety of things that involved in that exchange environment that exists between administration and the inmate population. We don't always articulate it that way,
Mhm.
but we have to understand that that is exactly what we're talking about.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Mr. Barber, with your connection with the Department of Corrections here in your experience, what would you say a good time credit policy, if established here in Michigan, how that could help the struggles that are seen not only in the workplace, but also in those that are housed there, as far as recidivism or in any other capacity that you may see?
Yeah, I agree with Pete. I don't think that it impacts recidivism, but it does give wardens, as he said, another tool to use. It provides some incentive, a way to reward people for uh, positive behavior and for engaging in behaviors that we want to see. And then also a means to show our displeasure with other kinds of behaviors, right? So I think it serves, from the wardens I knew when we had good time, uh, they all liked good time and really didn't want to see it eliminated. We've kind of gone through a series of good times type things here. We had traditional kind of good time that was a pretty complicated formula and created by state law. That was rescinded, and then we came up with disciplinary credits, which was kind of good time light. So it was much less time off a person's sentence, changed the structure around a little bit. But both laws allowed for institutional staff to be part of that process. And I think that would be really significant if Michigan reenacts a good time law, is to have staff as part of that process. I think if officers and other staff are more engaged with they're engaged with their population, clearly, but if they were more engaged with how that interaction between the population they manage, the incarcerated population, and their actions, how that all works, then I think you're going to see some better outcomes across the board. So I think there are some benefits to it. I honestly think it's going to be a heavy lift here in Michigan to reinstitute that. But I appreciate where you guys are going and what your thoughts are. I think we're going to have to look at doing a lot of educating of the prison staff inside if good time were to come back in Michigan, so that they have an understanding of what it is, why we have it, how it's used, and what their role is in that piece of it. Getting buy-in from folks is huge to get people going, both the incarcerated population and the employee population. You know, it's a little microcosm inside those prisons. Our facilities are small cities. You know, I think our smallest facility has just over 1,000 people, and they typically run about 1,200 or more. So depending upon what facility is. So I think that there are a number of things that would be helpful to the system, but making folks part of the process and getting that buy-in, I think, are biggies.
That brings up another point as we kick it over to Professor G to address the same question. But we've, in our outreach over the last several months, we've been, given the question or faced with the question of, do we want to, hand over that type of power or authority to a corrections officer to be in control of, whether or not somebody would receive that good time credit, if in fact, what our asks are, if, a 30-day tenure of no misconduct or class 1 conducts being written at 30 days would then be taken off the minimum and maximum sentence. Often the question has been posed if, a corrections officer, and these things quite possibly could happen, is having a bad day and just decides to arbitrarily, write a ticket on someone for that. Professor, have, as you all approach criminal justice reform and the legal system itself from a sociological perspective, or that being included in some of the curriculum, how do you think a good time credit policy not only would help with some of the struggles that we've spoken about here this evening, but also how it could be used in a manner that was most beneficial and not as a tool of control of, let's say, the administration?
Well, I wanted to go back real quick. For me, when I think about good time, I don't think about it just as the absence of bad behavior. it's got to be more than that. You know, if it's, okay, you've got the absence of behavior, but what have you done in addition to that? If our goal is to correct and reintegrate, which we're going to do at 95%, why aren't we incorporating other attributes, other desired expectations? And we need to set those bars fairly high, but achievable within the context of the prison. So is it education? Is it job training? Is it what are these other things that we can give a reward for that costs nothing, and also keep that bad behavior down? And so for me, you got to have both, and it's got to be so. When you get buy-in, when you go down and you ask those COs, those frontline COs, what would you consider to be good behavior in your day-to-day interaction? What's good behavior for you? Is it total and complete compliance? Because that may be a little bit problematic, right? If there are very clear guidelines, this is what's going to be rewarded for, this is what's going to get a ticket, you know, then you have a better system that is open for review, right? And when we think about good time credit, it's not that it's, oh, congratulations, you've been awarded X number of days of good time credit, you're gone. You still need to do that risk, needs, responsivity aspect. You need to evaluate to what degree, what does that person need once they're reintegrated, once they're back in the community because they've gotten the good time. You know, they could get the good time behavior, be let out on parole, and it go directly back into the same pattern of behavior. But if you give good time, you put them out on parole, and you have that evaluation of risk, evaluation of need, and a system that can respond to both of those, then you've got a system that's going to work. And again, maybe overly idealistic, but
Right.
that's what I'm reading is saying. And that's what I'm seeing in the Finnish prisons.
Well, thank you for that. I know that here in a moment, we'll move to some of the attendees' questions that we have, but I'd like to, there's been an overall theme in some of the responses, and even in the questions about the education piece here, and how we educate, or exactly what is it, whom we educate and what we educate them on. As the campaign director here, some of my experience in the advocacy world has been with statewide organizations here in Michigan for criminal justice reform, in a couple of different spaces. But prior to my work as an advocate here or an organizer, I was a resident of the Michigan Department of Corrections for 24 years. At the age of 16, I was sentenced and convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison here. Throughout the duration of that time, probably the first 7 years, was a very strenuous and arduous and an adjustment period. After that, early 20s, there was a shift at some point where I began to realize that I was the common denominator in all of my issues, and things started to get a little better. But I recall being in a program in about, I believe it was 1997, that was a cognitive behavioral therapy program with MDOC. It was being offered at the Riverside Correctional Facility, a level 4 facility where I was housed at the time. That program was then taken away for whatever reasons. At the time, I can't recall what it was, but I didn't see any semblance of it until the last year of my incarceration, when I was chosen to facilitate the VPP program here. And one of the things that I see that I've seen in my 24 years incarcerated, is that the programs that were offered, if they were giving at the front end of a person's sentence, it would do them so much better throughout the duration of their time, where the behavior, then they have the tools and the resources by which to reach into and use throughout that sentence. And I know there's a few questions this evening, and I just wanted to speak to that piece as we move to one of our attendees' questions here, mentioning that there should be a check and balance system. But also, what about mentoring new residents to the prison system for good time credit? So I guess that would speak to a program of sorts that would allow inmates who've been around for some time to kind of get those folks acclimated as their new commitments to the Department of Corrections. And here in Michigan, I can say that probably it would be tough getting a program like that instituted inside MDOC. But the closest thing to it is the VPP program, which is a violence prevention program. I know as of in recent years, Lansing was able to allow or began to allow folks who were serving life sentences to be the facilitators for it, which gave that mentor-mentee feeling, because most of the folks who were lifers had been around for 20 plus years, were 40, 50, 60 years old. The folks who were being put into VPP were, high recidivism rate, 18 to 25 to 30 year range. So, as far as the mentoring piece is concerned, there is a program that kind of serves that space. It could be fleshed out. It could be built out more. I'm sure anything could be made better, but there are a few things that will kind of resemble that inside MDLC. I'm looking to see if there was a couple of other questions at the beginning, but what do you all have? And is there any thoughts or comments about what a mentoring system could do inside MDLC?
I don't know anything about MD, the Michigan Department of Corrections, but let me just say this. From a pure statistical approach, we know who's coming into corrections and at what age. So we know who's a first-time offender. We know the demographics of the new intake in the corrections, and we know the demographics of those who are at different levels of their incarceration experience. And I say experience because that's what it is. And so if you spend any time in a corrections environment as you have, Mr. Griffin, then you understand that it's important to the correction environment that inmates who are serving long terms are included into the climate of an institution. In other words, long-term inmates and inmates who have approached a certain level of maturity are the best inmates to manage. So then why wouldn't I use those inmates to deal with new intake? Why wouldn't I do that?
Exactly.
Not only for the climate of the institution, but also to ensure that this 22-year-old rabble rouser, still pissing vinegar, still thinking he can bring the culture of his street experience into the prison environment, understands that this is a new experience. So prison administrators have to be willing to entrust a certain part of their intake experience to that population of inmates who can best help them manage the climate and also maintain behaviors. And we know, and I know inmates at 30, 35, 40 years of age and older don't want to have a lot of interaction with the youngsters. We don't even want to be housed with them.
Right.
But it's the youngsters, particularly those who are now sentenced to long term, that we need to understand first their reality. Their reality that the judge said 20, 25, 30 years. So we got to get older inmates to help them understand that reality. And then based on that reality, how do you now orient yourself into being a productive individuals. So now we can start programming you to reentry. We
Gotcha.
don't get you to understand your reality, then we can't start working with you towards reentry. So I'm different, maybe a little bit, than a lot of corrections administrators because I came in at a different level. I came in having to orient myself to how disruptive prisons are populated by people who don't have hope or don't know what the reality is. When you talk about giving them some hope, then you can start working towards programming these individuals towards what's best for them and even long-term lifers. Hope gives them some option to work into getting whatever they need to get done, work on their visits, work on their commissary, work on the job that they're going to have, work on their visit. There are things that you can build into that experience that allows an individual not to be desperate, but to have hope. They're desperate and then they don't see any hope, then they become combative, they become aggressive, or you're not able to reduce that aggressiveness that they bring into the institution. And then we have to remember the portion of inmates, of men and women that come into the system who have some innate or acute mental health issues that have never been addressed. And so getting to a platform where you can get those mental health issues addressed while you're trying to orient them into how to survive in the inmate population. You got an inmate coming to an institution that can't read and write, and you have a electronic or you have a system for commissary or other kinds of inmate banking that requires some intellect and use of computers, and you don't do that, you don't train that, then that person becomes vulnerable. And that person becomes vulnerable, and now his inmate, his commissary, his phone calls, everything becomes subject to the scavengers. So you gotta create an environment where you nullify that. And so those are the kinds of things that I look at.
Yeah, to your point, and I think all of you gentlemen have spoken on the education piece, and we know more than anything if the culture inside of prison, both from the administrative side and those who are housed there, if the cultural needle isn't moved, the policy can be in place, but the culture won't move that to where.
Thank you.
One of and this may be our last question here as we're getting close to our time, but one of our attendees has asked, how can more programs be offered at the prison level so that more inmates have access to them? And I believe, Keith, this may be a question most suited for you as we look at how we can make sure that inmates have access to those programs actually. How do you believe that we can be more efficient and effective in how we open up the programming in our correction systems and make that affordable to those inmates?
Yeah, and there's already actually a move going on right now to look at exactly at that, a legislative view of that. The Senate Oversight Committee is going to be looking at the Auditor General's reports about prisoner classification and programming coming up in the not too distant future, a couple of weeks here, I think. So we have a couple of different processes to look at that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. It froze up for a second here. It was my slow internet, as I told you sometimes. So yeah, I guess I lost my train of thought here because of that. So I apologize.
Oh, no problems. No problems. There's an additional question. One of our attendees has asked, does any one of the panelists know about the state of Michigan changing anything about the mandatory nature of felony murder for the aiders and abettors? And I guess, and I'm sure that Mr. G and Mr. Barber both are very aware of the felony murder policy or statute here in Michigan. So is there any conversations about a legislative push or any changes to the way in which aiders and abettors are sentenced in the mandatory nature for felony murder?
I'm going to have to defer to Mr. Barber on this one. I'm not familiar with anything at this point.
Yeah, I have not seen any movement legislatively to do that either. So I guess right now, as far as I know, there is not any movement to go in that direction.
There
So
are,
it could be done. It could be done legislatively, I think.
there
But
are a few organizations working on some of those issues around the state. And if you I'll make sure that Mariah and myself drop our email addresses there, and we can connect you with those to our attendee who posed that question. We can connect you with an organization or two that that is more abreast on that issue and that's heading up anything regarding felony murder.
And I know there's been a few questions just in regards to what is our current progress and what are we working on right now. So here at Michigan Justice Advocacy, we have been working on educating the state across. So I know both correction officers, we've reached out to the MCO, which is the Michigan Correction Officers Association. As you can see, we have a wide variety of panelists this evening. We've had conversations with many individuals like themselves across the state of Michigan. So right now, a lot of our work is education. We are currently in the process of drafting our bill. We expect our draft will be finished sometime this month, at which time we will be working within the legislature to get co-sponsors and sponsorships. That is one process, politics, that always takes time. Unfortunately, none of us can change law overnight usually. It usually takes time. So our biggest work right now is educating, as they have talked about. We talk about educating within the system for those who are currently incarcerated, but it's also education of the public. Many individuals don't understand the system and don't have a personal understanding of all of these nuances. So our job here and why we are hosting some of these panels to discuss is to educate the public of Michigan about what is going on and how we can make this change and why this change is important. So we will spend the summer and there will be many volunteer opportunities throughout the summer, whether you'd like to do some door knocking, phone banking, or legislative visits that we can set up with our lawmakers in support and discussion about a good time credit bill. So we expect we will introduce our bill after the summer session in the September timeframe. And then it goes through the normal process of politics. They get to have hearings and testimonies and everything that goes with that within the Lansing legislator. So that is where we see our bill going at this point in time, but the opportunity to learn more about the system and educate others about how this system works and why we want to make these positive changes for correction officers, for incarcerated citizens, and for crime survivors is what these panels are for. So please be sure to share them. Follow us on social media, and very easy, you can go to our website, mijustice.org, and sign up for our newsletters where we keep you up to date and you can see regular updates about what our progress is and our panels that are coming up in the future.
Yes, thank you for that, Mariah. Before we begin to close out, I know that Mr. Barber wanted to circle back to the question about programming. So, Keith, if you're ready to speak to that before we close out here, you have a few moments to do so now.
Great, thank you, Rich. Yeah, so the department is doing much better in getting people into programming than they have, but it still has a ways to go. And again, there's a legislative group that's looking at that, getting prisoners into programming in a timely manner. There's been boilerplate legislative language requiring the department to report on who is past their ERD and hasn't been in the programming and lots of different things like that. I think we're only limited by how much we want to use our imagination, if you will, on finding different kinds of programs to bring in. You will see a much different programming structure at the women's facility than you'll see at the male facilities. So, so they've had to really think outside the box over the years at the women's facility, and they've done that, and they've implemented a lot more programming than you see at the male facilities, including some of the mentorship that you were talking about earlier. So there is a way to do it. It's not free. And one thing I would hate to see happen is trying to lump too many people into a program. I think there's a point of diminishing returns if you, the clinicians think that 10 or 12 people in a group setting is the way to go, and then you increase it to 20, you may not have the same outcomes. And so those are the things you have to watch out for. And then we need to use technology, and we could do a better job at using that, tablets, the closed circuit TV system they have in the prison, to use those for programming situations. I think those are underutilized. So that's another way it could be done. And that probably would not cost a great deal of money to do. So there are a lot of things that could be done, but we're in a better place than we were back when I started in 1982. I can tell you that.
Well, I can attest to that. And throughout the tenure of my time in the Department of Corrections, I've seen it, transform the administration, the policies, the programs. And I have to say that it was a much better place leaving than it was as I came in. So thank you, gentlemen, all of you, for joining us tonight and spending your evening, very busy evening on a weekday, having this discussion with us. For those folks who've been in attendance here, to follow back up on Mariah's direction, please be mindful that we will be sending out reminders of upcoming town halls. Please share those with your personal and professional networks. And if anybody on this call who's attended here tonight, if there's any opportunities that you'd like to take advantage of for volunteering, please feel free to reach out either to myself, Mariah directly, or to contact our website. With that being said, thank you all for joining Michigan Justice Advocacy here in our discussion on good time credit policies and the correction systems and how that may affect either side of the discussion. Be on the lookout for future town halls where we'll continue to roll this particular topic out in our legislative push over the remainder of this year.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
Thanks much. This was great.
Thank you all.
Guys, enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.